Hi, good evening. Thank you everybody for being here for our talk on self-care. And to start off, we decided that maybe we'll start with a little meditation, just a quick one. Before we talk about self-care, let's try to do a little self-care, right? So sit up nice and tall, relaxing the face, your eyes, your jaw. Notice any tension you may have in your neck and your shoulders, and just try to let that go. Pulling the shoulders away from the ears, maybe wiggling it out a little bit, releasing any tension. Notice your chest as it rises and falls, the expansiveness with your inhale, and a slight heaviness with the exhale. Bringing all your focus to your being, letting go of everything outside this moment. Noticing your back and your spine. Is there any discomfort? Are you relaxed? Releasing any tension in your belly, letting that breath flow freely. Your hips rounded and open, bringing your awareness there. Noticing your legs, releasing any tension in the muscles. Letting go of that control. Finally, sending a little bit of awareness and attention to your feet. Are they grounded? And then come back to the breath, noticing if it's light or full. And try to notice how you feel in this moment. Is it different than when you first logged on? Different than earlier today? Let's just take a few more breaths here. And start to bring some movement back into your limbs. Maybe open your eyes as we come back to awareness, fully ready to take in the message that we're sending to you today. Let's take care of ourselves.
Thank you so much, Maggie, and thank you for everyone that participated in the meditation as we get started. Thank you for being here today. This is going to be a very, very interactive conversation where we're going to be talking about a pretty triggering yet much necessary topic of self-care and how guilt and shame can affect our self-care practice. Throughout the discussion, please participate whether you choose to raise your hand and want to use your voice. You can open up your cameras if you'd like. We are going to be recording this. We will send a copy tomorrow along with the worksheets that I sent out earlier this week. If you have not received the worksheet, you will receive it tomorrow. And it's not really a worksheet that we're going to be working on throughout the talk. It's just a worksheet that I sent out so that you can use to write notes, to kind of process a lot of the information that you're going to be receiving today. Just a safe space so that you can feel comfortable just discussing or just processing what we talk about today. I am Dr. Mariela de Ocares. I am one of the founders of Restore. Self-care is actually a near and dear topic to me. I did my dissertation on burnout and self-care, so I've been researching, learning, and trying to make self-care a part of my daily practice for quite some time. I struggle just like everybody else, but it is a daily intention that I set so that I'm able to do it. So we definitely encourage you to participate via chat. We want to hear your voices. We want to hear, your comments, your opinions, because again, this is a conversation. It's not really a class per se. I'm gonna let my co-hosts also introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with the discussion.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you, Dr. Yocares. We're very happy to be here today. It's a very special occasion where this is all about self-care and self-love and understanding better how we can care better in every aspect, mind, body, and soul. And thank you so much for being here, making this special time for you. And my name is Yvonne Mesa, and I'm co-founder with Dr. Mariela Diocares of Restore Health and Wellness Institute, and it's my privilege to be a part of this webinar, along with Maggie Harrison, who is a wellness and self-care expert, who is joining us today for the second and third time. This is the third time that we have Maggie, and we appreciate Maggie for everything that she's been sharing with us. And we want to hear more about what Maggie is doing. But in regards to myself and self-care, just like Dr. Yukaris just mentioned, it's been a journey. And every day I try to do my best to keep myself in best way possible, feeding and giving me all the nourishment that I can get. But I do have my own personal struggles, and that's why I'm here with you guys, sharing and learning of self-care and everything that we can to love ourselves better and live intentionally. So Maggie, can you please share with us a little bit about what you're doing and everything that you want to add about this very important topic?
Yes, hello. I'm Maggie from Riverside, California. Um, Quickly, my history is that I was years ago, I was under a lot of stress. I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. I think because of that was a side effect of the stress, it triggers it. So I had to really into, I found yoga and delve deep into self-care, even though, and I think we're going to talk about this, even though I don't like to take care of myself. I love serves is what my grandmother taught me. So that was a really hard journey for me. So I love being here and being able to share my story and being able to just give a little bit of insight to how we can incorporate it in our everyday lives, because it's so necessary.
Absolutely. And if everyone would just let us know in the chat right now, we're just curious to see where you're joining us from. It seems like we have people from all over the world, not just California. I'm currently in Corona, California as well. So we have people from different states, different countries. So thank you so much for joining us. I know that the time difference for a lot of people is probably not the same as ours. So thank you for making time for this conversation. So let's get started. Let's talk about what self-care is, and let's talk about that icky subject of guilt and shame. And just, before we get started, we definitely want to talk about what the difference between guilt and shame is, because a lot of times it's grouped together like it's the same thing, and it really is not. Guilt and shame are two completely different things. Maggie, Yvonne, what are definitions of guilt and shame?
I kind of define it as guilt is I feel bad about something. Shame is I feel bad about me, is my quick way of what I learned in my journey.
Absolutely.
Correct. And what I understand is when I feel guilty, I feel remorse. When I feel shame, there's some kind of painful feeling about something that I did consciously that I knew it was improper. That's what I understand the difference is.
Absolutely. A lot of times guilt is about a specific thing that we feel guilty about, right? It could be that, we didn't do those 15 to 30 minutes of exercise that we should do every day, or at least that's what the experts say. Or, instead of, when we were feeling kind of bad, instead of reaching for some carrots and ranch dressing, we reached for some Funyuns, right? So then that guilt comes in and it consumes us. It takes away the joy out of our life. And it's not just centered on one area. It can actually kind of touch every single area in our life. And then when we feel shame, it's a feeling of everything just being wrong. Like you make one mistake and then just your whole life is going to fall apart, right? We tend to make it about everything instead of just focusing about the one thing that we actually do feel shame and guilt about. And then self-care. Self-care is a very interesting topic, at least personally for me, because the way that I define self-care, and I'm curious to see what everyone that's joining us today, how do you define self-care? What is your definition and or understanding? Let us know in the chat of what self-care is. But when we talk about self-care, usually the conversation is, okay, well, it's you going to a spa day, or it's you reading a book, or it's you listening to music, when in reality, self-care is a very personal journey, right? It's something that works very specifically for me, because what works for somebody else may not work for me specifically. Personally, for me, self-care is, before I go to bed, I need to read at least 30 to 45 minutes in order for my brain and my body to be able to find calm. Otherwise, what happens is I stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning just thinking about my day and thinking about what I have to do the next day. And then it's just a lot of anxiety. And then I feel really stressed out because I'm not getting enough sleep. And then I know that the next day is going to be a terrible day, and so on and so forth, right? But one of the things that I have found personally as part of my bedtime routine, and actually having a bedtime routine is part of self-care as well, is finding that I do need to read. I need to be able to just calm myself down through reading. And it has to be reading that is completely not related to my field, right? So usually it's fiction, usually it's, fantasy or sci-fi or whatever it is. but definitely not related to the type of work that I do. So we're getting people that are telling us, okay, so self-care is taking care of your physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional needs. Absolutely. And we are going to be talking about the four main ones, which are those. Definitely taking care of those aspects of self-care. There are between 4 and 8 dimensions of self-care, but we will be focusing on 4. But yeah, we definitely want to hear what are some ways, or what is your understanding of self-care? And I'll let my Yvonne and Maggie tell us what their definitions are as well.
Well, I was reading a little bit about the topic and it caught my attention, the definition, and let me share this with you because I thought it was very interesting. That one of the reasons why we struggle with feeling guilt about self-care is because we don't understand the true definition of self-care. And what it says is that the practice of self-care is a practice of taking an active role in protecting one's own well-being and happiness, in particular during periods of stress. I love that part. It says taking action to preserve your own health, taking an active role in protecting one's own well-being and happiness. That's what self-care is. And I think it's something that we totally have control over. And it's just a matter of giving it the importance that is needed and respecting your own self, loving yourself that much so that you can respect your agenda and that specific time that you want to have to restore, to have a better version of yourself and regain all the things that you need for to be able to continue serving others and loving others as you love yourself. Maggie, your thoughts?
I love that. For me and my restorative yoga background, I like to come back to like the nervous system. We talk a lot about fight or flight versus relaxation. There's the two nervous systems you can be in. And most of the time we're in fight or flight because we're rushing to do this and rushing to do that. So anything that you can do that makes you feel relaxed, that gets your heart rate down, that for me right now, because it's spring, is gardening. I love getting my hands in the dirt. This year is the first year since I've moved to my new place where my garden is flourishing. I'm very excited about it. And that just makes me feel so like just a little hobby or something to take you away from your work, your kids. Sometimes kids are your joy if you can take them to the park and it gives you your parenting purpose. I was just reading today about parenting burnout. That's something I've been trying to think about, especially coming out of quarantine. A lot of parents have felt burnout. And so I was reading a couple case studies about that. And I guess it's huge across the world, especially in Australia. I saw we had a few people in Australia in the chat, and there was a lot of studies in Australia. So it was saying that even as parents, giving your parenting purpose, even if you can't get away from your kids, give them something and give yourself something to enjoy that time. And I thought that was a really good way to think about self-care, because we can't always get away, but giving it pleasure instead of just anxiety. So that's my.
And like you mentioned, it's about finding that balance. And I think that a lot of us struggle to find that balance when we have so many distractions and responsibilities coming at us from different directions at all times, right? And so finding that work-life balance, I don't even think it's a work-life balance. I just think it's a life balance overall, right? It's a huge umbrella that we all struggle to have, regardless of the field or responsibilities that we have. And a lot of times, and we're going to talk a little bit about trauma. And when I talk about trauma, violence or exposure to violence is one type of trauma, but there are other types of trauma as well. And just to clarify for the purposes of our conversation today, we're going to be, when I talk about trauma, again, it's not just the exposure to violence. It could be living with somebody that has substance abuse. It could be emotional negligence or even emotional abuse. It could be living with someone that has an unmanaged mental health illness. because that can actually have secondary trauma symptoms for the person that experiences it. Having somebody that has an illness can also be a form of trauma. And obviously, we're all very familiar with bullying. So when I talk about trauma, to me, it is a lot of psychological and emotional trauma because that is what I focus on. And there are many aspects of it as well. But for those of us that have experienced trauma, we live with a lot of guilt and shame related to that traumatic event. So whether that event was a one-time thing or whether that was an ongoing traumatic experience, there is that level of guilt and shame that has been associated with it because it's almost like it's side effects or after effects of the trauma of, you know, because I've experienced this big, huge thing in my life, we don't want to bring attention to ourselves. We don't want to kind of like bring ourselves to the forefront because that means that we have to be vulnerable, because that means that we have to allow ourselves to let people in when we have worked really hard to keep people out. And if this resonates with you, I'm curious, please share it with us in the chat if you feel comfortable. Hopefully we are providing a safe space so that you are able to open up. But trauma, I work with most of my clients have experienced a form of trauma. And the thing is with trauma, it's not like you can snap your fingers, go to therapy for 6 times and you're fixed. First of all, therapy is not about fixing a person. It's about providing support and direction in order for them to find that balance. But when it comes to trauma, it's not that you get fixed. What you ultimately are working through in therapy is finding coping skills and ways to process the trauma in order for it not to completely rule your life, right? In order for you to be able to grow and be able to function in a way that brings you that balance that you're searching for. And, you know, if you haven't done the work to process the trauma, when you're told, well, you know, you can just fix whatever stress or depression or anxiety or whatever you're experiencing through self-care, it's not that simple. Building a self-care practice takes time. It takes trial and error. It takes us understanding that what may have worked for me yesterday doesn't necessarily work for me today because I have a different need, because my emotions are different than they were yesterday, or maybe they're the same, but that type of self-care doesn't necessarily work for me today and I need something else. It is also possible for us to outgrow certain self-care practices, right? It's very different. And I can remember when I was single and young and didn't have children, what I did then, as opposed to now having children, is going to be very different as well, because I need to accommodate their needs. And Maggie had mentioned, you know, we're going to talk about what it means that for a lot of us, because of our culture, and maybe this resonates with you as well, we weren't shown by our parents to do self-care, right? In fact, taking time for you, it's a selfish act, and you don't do selfish acts because you are here to take care of other people. Thoughts?
Yes, exactly. Me as a Hispanic lady, I was able to witness that in my family growing up. My mother, my grandma, and even in my relatives' families, see how they focus more on serving and being there for their families, working hard, but not much of the self-care. And it wasn't practiced. It was not taught to us as children, their children. And so it was later on that we started learning more about how important it is and practice it, incorporating those practices in our daily lives and receiving benefit from it. But originally, our beliefs were just there, serve the family, go to work, and provide, but not much of the self-care. And it was something that it was mainly in my Hispanic family. And that's what I observe it the most. How about you, Maggie?
Yeah, I was just thinking when you were talking, so many of us, and I think it's a generational thing. My grandmother helped raise me, and coming out of the Great Depression and things like that, like it's only hard work, and that's what creates value. And then I got to thinking about, most of us were here because something has happened in our lives. Like you were talking about psychological trauma. In my case, it was disease. Something's happened where now we have to do self-care, or else we're sunk, or we're going to go insane. And so I was thinking about, we were talking about parenting earlier, and so I just had this epiphany, like I really need to instill the values of self-care to my children. Like I need to let them know how important it is. And that was kind of off topic, but it just rung true to me when we were talking about that. Cause yeah, that was not taught to me at all. And I had to have trauma first, or, so it's
Or
interesting.
have the doctor tell you need to slow down, right?
Right. Yeah. The doctors.
And it's usually not the doctor saying you have to do self-care. It's usually you need to slow down, or you need to make a huge lifestyle change. And then it just becomes super overwhelming, like, oh my God, I need to change my diet, or I need to stop working, or I need to, right? These huge life changes, when in reality, self-care doesn't need to be such a huge thing. It can be a gentle introduction into our daily routine. So I think you bring up a very valuable point. I think that it is our responsibility as parents to introduce, and not just tell our children, but show them that it is okay to do self-care. Show them that it is okay to turn off our phones at a certain time and go read a book. Or, I shared in another webinar that one morning I just grabbed a cup of coffee, went in my room, and I was just looking out the window and drinking my cup of coffee. And my 21-year-old son was freaking out because he's like, Mom, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I'm just enjoying my cup of coffee. That's it. He's like, are you sure you're okay? I'm like, yeah, I needed 15 minutes to recalibrate. I just needed 15 minutes of quiet and me in order to just be able to face the day, because I knew that it was going to be a tough day. So a lot of times it's not even about telling our children, just show them, because our children, regardless of the age that they are constantly watching and learning from us.
Yes, and it doesn't have to be that you break the bank and go to a very expensive retreat and go to a very fancy vacation resort or anything like that. It's just a few minutes for you to enjoy, to be in a quiet place and do whatever your body needs, whatever your body's asking you. That's enough to start restoring, to dedicate some specific time, to give yourself value and the time, the dedication that your body needs to continue in your daily activities. And I find it difficult. To me, it has been a very big challenge in life to balance everything, like Dr. Ducaris was saying. And your body is amazing. Your body tells you, hey, it's time to stop. It's time to give yourself a break. And if you don't listen, then the consequences come when you start feeling sick and you're forced to stop. You're forced to invest that time and money that you could have invested in self-care, that you now you need to go and invest it in probably a medication, or you need to stop working. You're forced because that's what happens when your body doesn't get the time that the body needs to recover and restore. So yes, it's super, super important. And we're here to share with you guys our experiences. And I admire from Maggie, she's always inspiring me to dedicate and use different ways. She's very creative, and she's always have great advice in regards to how you can invest time for yourself. And she's very, her personality is always very inviting to relax and to restore. Same, Dr. Yokaris is always talking about how important it is, self-care, and I'm joining them, and I hope that we all learn a little bit this afternoon of the different ways we can use self-care. But yes, our roles are super important. We invest ourselves in working hard and being a mother or father, because fathers also need, males also need self-care. So we all get invested in our responsibilities, but one of our responsibilities is also caring for your body, caring for your emotional health. And we serve, and there's always something important to do. There's also a list there for us to do, but why not including some self-care in our daily activities and put it top of our priority list? So I think that even though we have these roles, we need to use that time to restore and to dedicate some time for self-care. Maggie, do you have some advice as to what creative ways of using self-care in a busy lifestyle could be?
We talked about breath work, one of our webinars, and that could be a quick and easy 1 to 5 minute thing. If you're feeling overwhelmed at any point, taking a deep breath through the nose and exhaling out the mouth. That is everyone, and it's annoying when people tell you just take a deep breath, it'll be fine, but it actually works. There's physiology behind it that resets the nervous system. And I always thought it was really annoying until I realized, oh yeah, it's really a thing. So that's something. For me as a mom, sometimes just locking the door and just having 10 minutes where I can stare off into space, like Mariella was talking about, or just going on my phone, because I don't really go on my phone because I have a 2-year-old. So I can't go on my phone or else she wants to be on it. And I don't want that. So, like Mariella said, reading a book. My thing, like I said earlier, is gardening. But then once the sun goes down, I like to macrame. Just a nice little indoor hobby. And I think that's what Yvonne was talking about earlier when I brought macrame. We were tying knots as like a relaxation technique. And I never got into crocheting or knitting because it was too complicated to me, but just tying knots and focusing on the fabric and detaching from the stresses outside. So just finding something that you can do in your living room or in your car, beyond just taking a day spa day, which I also encourage, but it just isn't always possible.
I think it's also important to talk about, and it's being talked about in the chat as well, is that mindset of deserving. You have to complete certain amount of tasks before you deserve time for self-care, or you deserve a timeout, or you've earned some self-care, right? Which to me, I see it as, well, if we really want to get technical, then that would mean that you have to work really hard in order to deserve to eat, in order to deserve to sleep, right? Because self-care is definitely something that does not need to be deserved. And a lot of times that's how we see it, as, okay, once I complete everything throughout my day, maybe 15 minutes before I go to bed, I'll do self-care. And the thing with that is, it's not a wrong thing. It's just that, are we in the right mindset to do self-care, right? A lot of times we're like, okay, I'm going to put it on my calendar and I'm going to do 15 minutes of self-care. And so we schedule it and we're in those 15 minutes. And what happens? We're constantly berating ourselves because we have all of these thoughts that are coming in our head. And we're like, no, I should be relaxing. I should be doing something to help me find balance and to help me find joy and pleasure. And all we're doing is just fighting our thoughts, because now we have quiet and we have no distractions. And so all of these things are coming at us and we don't know how to handle them. And so I think that a lot of times it's giving ourselves that permission to say, you know what, it's not about deserving. It's not about me earning this. It's about me needing this. It's about it being a necessity. It's about it being part of my daily practice. And it could be something as simple as, and when I get the travel bug, I just look at Airbnbs and I look at like cottages and tiny houses for 5 minutes. That to me helps me recalibrate. And I'm like, okay, now I know where I'm going to go the next time I have, 3 days off or whatever. But that gives me a different mindset, especially when I notice that I'm procrastinating a lot. And I was talking to a colleague yesterday and I'm like, I have all these things that I need to do, but I'm procrastinating. And we were talking about self-care and I'm like, I completely understand. It is my body's way, my mind's alert system letting me know that, you know what, you've kind of been lagging on your self-care. So maybe that needs to change. And that's one thing that I think that a lot of us ignore, right? Our minds are constantly filtering information. Our minds are constantly letting us know what we need. And so we think, okay, you know what? No, I don't need to do self-care. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll set it aside and I won't make it a priority. And so then what happens is our body's like, okay, fine. You're not going to pay attention to the fact that you need to slow down. Then let me give you some aches and pains. Let me give you some things so that you can slow down and start to take care of your body. Because again, our mind and our body are so wise that they are constantly giving us alerts, kind of like we get notifications on our phones and we swipe them. Our bodies do the same thing. And so instead of swiping them, let's take those moments to just take care of them, right? What is your body trying to tell you? What is your mind trying to tell you? When you're not able to sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning and you're scrolling through social media, and I personally hate social media, and I don't scroll social media because that's not something that I need in my life. But what is it that you're really not facing or confronting or processing or giving time to just sit with? And a lot of times it's those really tough feelings that we have, right? It's those difficult emotions that we don't want to confront because we're scared, because they're tough, because that means that we have to be vulnerable. And that's scary a lot of times. Yes, Joe, self-sabotage. A lot of us do that. Absolutely, we do self-sabotage. It's so easy to just get distracted and blame that as a reason to not do self-care. We live in a society, and I can only speak about the States. We live in a culture where being busy, it's almost like a badge of honor, right? If you're busy, that means that you are, I don't know, being an effective member of society. But just because you're busy doesn't mean that you're being productive. Because a lot of times you taking that day off and just doing something random, like just going to the beach and just taking in the waves and the sunshine and the sand, may be more productive than you putting in 6 hours of work in front of a computer and not taking any breaks.
Yeah, because your body's telling you it's too much for you, and you really say you keep on going, but you're not productive. You're not connecting with your mind, and your production is not reflecting because there's a disconnect. Your body's telling you you need to stop, you need to take a break. And it's difficult. Sometimes it's hard for me. It's very hard to say no. Sometimes when I have all these responsibilities and people keep coming to me and bringing different things they need me to contribute or to do for them and to help my family, my parents. It's difficult for me to say no because I feel they need me. We keep serving and serving, and that brings me to the example that Maggie was giving us about the bucket. Maggie, why don't you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's a book, I forget who the author is, but it's talks about your bucket, and we got the kids version for our kids, and it's very cool, and it talks about having like a bucket, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard of this before. And if you're always pouring your bucket of water into somebody, or emotions or livelihood into everybody else's buckets, eventually your bucket's empty. And so you need to do things to fill your bucket. And you also need to allow other people to fill your bucket, which is really hard for a lot of us that deal with guilt and shame, because, and feeling like that you deserve things. So it's the same thing, but it's off topic a little bit, because a lot of us that don't feel like we deserve self-care, we also don't feel like we deserve help, or we shouldn't ask for it. So the idea of keeping your emotional and physical wellness sacred almost, and prioritizing that. And because, like I said earlier, burnout, we talk about physical burnout where you get a disease, or you're just so exhausted you can't perform. Your doctor tells you that you need to do other things. There's also like emotional burnout, where you're on the verge of tears constantly, or you're very angry. And it's because your bucket is empty, for a, metaphor. And I like the metaphor because it's a nice visual of like, oh man, like my pail's dry. I gotta figure out what I need to do here so I can help myself, so I can still be a productive member of society.
And sometimes it's that you have to stop saying yes to people and say yes to your needs, and fill that bucket again so that you can continue serving others. That's something that I tend to forget, but it's so important. And having this mindfulness and this desire to love yourself, because it's also part of being respectful of yourself and showing love to yourself through self-care. And there are different types of self-care that we want to talk about. Why, Dr. Mariela, about these different types of self-care and some of the suggestions that we can give about these different types of self-care. I'm not sure if you have them.
Thank you, Joe, for sharing the book title and author. I think that that's an amazing metaphor to use. One that I also use with my clients is think of your it being like an emotional bank account, right? If you're constantly making withdrawals into it, at some point you're going to not have anything in there. And so you need to, for the most part, make more deposits. Most of us like to have money in the bank. So I would think that most of us would also like to have a pretty healthy emotional bank account. So, what are some of your deposits that you're making? And that's something that you need to realize on your own. When you feel that joy, when you feel like, you know what, this is good. It could be something, a very simple experience, but you feel that joy, you feel that satisfaction, you feel that pleasure from that activity, or even it could just be having a conversation with someone and you're like, wow, that was really good, whatever the topic was. So again, it's about those simple things that we can do throughout our day in order to make deposits into our emotional bank account. And then, there are obviously things that do take away from our bank account. I remember when I was at a job that I absolutely hated, I felt like it was a continuous withdrawal from my emotional bank account, and I wasn't able to give the best of me because I didn't have enough in my bank account to give. Some people are joy killers, they're emotional vampires, they just constantly taking away from you. Sometimes that could be your children, because they're very dependent on you, right? Yes, kids are joy and everything great, but they're also very dependent and needy, and you constantly need to be there for them, regardless of the age, it's like I'm finding out. So again, whatever metaphor works for you. Carl mentioned the, put your oxygen mask on first, whichever metaphor works for you, as long as it works for you and you're able to understand the concept of how necessary it is for us to do self-care, how important it is for us to do self-care. And, Maggie talked a little bit about burnouts. For the most part, we don't want to get to burnout, because when we are burnt out, things are pretty serious, right? we have let ourselves get to the point where, that cynicism, that not really finding joy or pleasure, that procrastination all kick in because we've just gotten to a point where we're just existing. There's very little joy, there's very little pleasure, there's very little motivation to do and make changes. And so, again, self-care doesn't need to be this huge life-changing thing, although it can be. And again, it's a personal choice, but do gentle introductions, explore, experiment. A lot of times we don't give ourselves permission to experiment with new things, right? We just go to the things that we know should work because everybody says need to work and they do work for them. So why is it not working for me? I can pretty much tell you a spa day for me would not work because too many people, most of the time you have to be naked and no, there's just too much happening there. But you know what? Let me take off with some food and a book to somewhere where there's water and trees and green for a day. And that fills up my emotional bank account. That works for me. Another way to also, and when we talk about the different types of self-care, we did mention that there's the emotional, the physical, the spiritual, and the psychological. Another way for me to notice that I need to do more self-care is the fact that I get triggered a lot more easily, right? And a trigger is one of the interesting things about trigger, and I have done extensive research about triggers, is that we usually get triggered through one of our five senses. And the thing is, we're not always aware that we have been triggered. We just understand that we are triggered, that something's not okay, right? I work with patients that tell me, everything was fine. I wasn't stressed or anything. And then they end up in the ER and they've been diagnosed with a panic or a panic attack. And so, then it's about, all right, let's talk about what got you there. Maybe during that day, maybe those 15 minutes leading up to it, you weren't stressed, but maybe this was stress that you had been carrying. Maybe it was a chronic stressful situation that you have been living. Maybe it's some unresolved or unprocessed trauma that you haven't worked through, right? Obviously, I'm always going to recommend counseling or therapy, but that's not the only thing. There are a lot of things that you can also do on your own to help you cope when you're getting triggered. And part of that is what you're doing today, right? Is attending a discussion like this where you're able to talk about the topic, because the more that we talk about topics, the more that we can normalize and open up safe spaces for discussion. But it's also about being able to sit with the feeling, as uncomfortable and as terrible as it can be, including shame and guilt, but just being able to sit with the feeling. Give yourself put it on a timer, give yourself 5 minutes, give yourself 10 minutes, and just sit with the feeling. But again, understand that feelings are like waves, right? They come and they go, right? Emotions and feelings are like that. Just like we have moments of happiness, we also have those moments of stress. We also have those moments of grief. We all also have those moments of shame and guilt. And that's not to dismiss them. That's just to understand and validate that it's okay for us to have a range of emotions, because as humans, we're not just made up of 4 or 5 emotions, right? That's not how we work. We have a spectrum of different emotions that a lot of times we don't have words for. For those of you that have HBO Max and have heard Brene Brown speak, and I don't know if you guys have, she has a series on HBO Max called Atlas of the Heart. It's based off her book, Atlas of the Heart. She's done a lot of research around shame, and she talks about the need for us to be able to have the right words in order to articulate what we're feeling, right? Because, for instance, I can say that I'm angry, but I've been taught as a clinician that usually anger is a secondary emotion and there's more underneath anger. So we see anger because it's socially acceptable to show anger, But underneath that anger, maybe I am feeling that shame, that guilt, that fear, that whatever it might be, right? There's also that term of being hangry. How many of us get hangry? I know I do. So, if you're feeling hungry, it may show up as anger, which is really interesting because, again, a lot of us have been taught to understand that it's okay for you to show anger, but it's not okay for you to show fear. It's not okay for you to show shame or guilt, right? And so just something to understand, absolutely, Joe, acknowledging our feelings. And again, sometimes it's very scary to acknowledge feelings because that means that we have to allow ourselves to be vulnerable. That means that we have to allow those emotional walls that we have spent years building. And I know that, especially if you've experienced trauma, you have been pretty diligent about building those walls. It's letting them down and allowing people in, the right people, not just anybody, but the right people in your life that are going to help you, that are going to help build you up. Whether it's a therapist, whether it's a partner that is healthy, family member, friend. Again, we're looking for healthy connections, not just any type of connection, because a lot of times those can actually cause more trauma than healing. Thoughts?
I always think about when you say build walls. I'm like, oh man, it took me a long time to to try, and I still have walls that I'm still trying to process, but through the journey of self-reflection and trying to be kind to myself and kind to others, eliminating relationships or situations and things, it's that self-care in itself. Trying to put up healthy boundaries. Somebody in the chat said something about boundaries. That's huge. Like you don't have to talk to everyone in your family. that is you can love them but not need them. And so that's kind of a little bit off topic, but I do think that is self-care.
Setting those boundaries with family. Yes, it's okay to set those healthy boundaries for sure. Maggie, personal experience, have you had to set boundaries with your family members?
Yeah. Well, within my diagnosis, I had to get a divorce. That was because that was one of my biggest triggers, and I didn't realize till afterwards there was, emotional abuse and gaslighting, and I didn't even know what gaslighting was. So that's probably why it happened. But I had to set that boundary. And then I had a cousin that was just a drain. We talk about things that are draining, and we didn't talk for a couple of years, and then we patched it up, and she found her journey, and as I was finding mine, and then it was good. So I'm glad that we reconnected, but you really do have to let people know that you don't want to damage your own self-worth, so.
And your own mental health. And
Yes,
that a lot of us struggle with owning the fact that we are responsible for our mental health, that we are responsible for maintaining our mental health, for acknowledging when we do need that help. Again, whether it's counseling, therapy, or just having a conversation with somebody that is going to be a positive connection for us, that is able to provide us support.
and then also coming around to the guilt and shame aspect of it, setting certain boundaries. Sometimes there's usually there's guilt involved, or you feel bad because you're expected to have relationships with certain people and family members, and then other family members can make you feel bad, and then you have to process that in addition to your original processing. So it can be very convoluted. But the awareness, I think, is the awareness of boundaries and what you need. That's huge for self-care. Knowing how you're being triggered, knowing who triggers you, and trying to take care of yourself.
Absolutely. Barbara, you actually have a really good, interesting question of, and my response to this would be, although you don't get to choose your family, your biological family, you could choose the family that you create, right? So, and the situation that you have presented of people living together but don't really talk, that can definitely be very stressful. And that also doesn't make it a very safe space to have conversations around feelings or emotions. But maybe one of the recommendations and or tips that I would make would be, you are able to choose who you decide to call family outside of your biological family. And one of the things that this generation, not my generation, because apparently I'm too old for it, but this generation that's coming on, is the fact that they are creating their own families through friends. And those friends, those connections, those relationships are actually more meaningful than biological family type of relationships, because you choose to spend time with them, you choose to make them a part of your life. And I think that a lot of times we forget that we are able to make that choice of who we allow into our lives. Because again, we do need to look out for our emotional mental health. Nobody's going to come in, unless you're under psychiatric care, and is going to tell you who to be friends with, right? And if they are, then that's probably not a healthy connection. But again, what are some of the choices that you have around you of who you can make meaningful connections, positive connections with? Leah, I think that's a great response, finding activities that bring about connection within the family. And again, there are going to be some family members where it's just impossible to make connections with. And that could be due to a number of things. And I don't know specifics, but in my experience, in my practice, those family members that struggle to make connections, again, we have the cultural aspect of not being taught to make those connections. I mean, I cannot remember ever my family just sitting down and having a conversation about how we're feeling. That was just not done, right? Yeah, maybe we had dinner together, but that didn't necessarily mean that we were talking about feelings or emotions. So again, it's, finding what are some ways that you are able to connect with not just your parents, but maybe even your children. And a lot of times it could just be something as simple as asking them, inviting that start of the conversation of, hey, what are some things that you like to do? And again, it doesn't always have to be about spending money. It could just be simple things. It could be that you have game night. Every Wednesday afternoon, you have game night. You order food or you cook together and then you have game night, or whatever provides those environments as a safe space for you to be able to make those connections with those family members. And there's different ways to connect, right? It could be through conversation. It could be, and I'm going to bring in love languages. The way that we do connect is through our love language. And we are actually going to be having a webinar about love languages in a couple of weeks, I believe. And we do invite you to sign up for that. But definitely find out what your love language is, because the way that you will make a connection is through that. Whether you're showing people through your love language that they matter and you care for them, or whether through that love language, they're able to show you that you're loved and cared for. So again, just something to think about. Last thoughts before we let you go, and whether you want to raise your hand or whether you want to share in the chats, just a couple more minutes and I'll give space for Maggie and Yvonne to give their last thoughts. Last thoughts before we let you all go.
We talked about a little bit yesterday, finding an accountability buddy and talking about finding your chosen family and doing things that feel good and making time, prioritizing your self-care or things that make you feel good, by allowing somebody in to share in the experience, like going to the gym. Like, I'm always better. The only time I go to the gym is when somebody else is meeting me there. And so doing that emotionally too, I think is very valuable if we need help starting off.
Yes, having somebody with you that will walk with you the journey and will remind you and will experience those benefits of self-care is great. But sometimes you just have to do it on your own. So find the time, be intentional, respect your boundaries, and respect yourself. Love and love yourself too, so you can continue to serve and love others. Those are my last thoughts. And we thank you so much for the time that you have given us this afternoon to share. And Dr. Mayela, do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah, I'm going to be sharing the worksheet that I sent everyone. Hopefully you received it. If you did not, like I said, we're going to be sending it tomorrow. Through this self-care plan, it does give you space for you to set some goals for self-care. It also gives you some space, for instance, and this is actually a really great coping skill, to write a Dear My Future Self letter. Just write down notes, figure out when you're actually bored, figure out what are some things that you can do when you're feeling sad. Set some intentions, and then we do have a page where there's actually 30-day self-care challenge. And make this your own. You can use the suggestions that are there. You can put your own, whatever works for you. The point is for you to, again, give yourself permission to explore, give yourself that space so that you are able to figure out what works for you in this moment and make it a part of your daily practice. So thank you so much to everyone. Thank you for participating in the chats. We hope to see you in our upcoming webinars. We do have a lot more planned. So definitely join us. I have spent I love having these conversations, again, not just because this topic is dear and near to my heart, but because I always learn every time we have conversations like this as well. So thank you so much to everyone. We hope to see you in a few weeks in our upcoming webinars. If you would like to work with us personally, please reach out to us, connect with us. Our contact information will be in the email that we'll send out tomorrow with the link